am departing from my usual procedure in making a general statement. We'll start the talk with a general statement instead of the usual biographical and other theoretical matters. Can I make that statement yet? Okay. The general statement is to the effect as those of you who know me will probably readily understand, even though I am, as I say, that have such a long membership in the Theosophical Society. I traveled as a Theosophical lecturer on 4 continents and all of that, and yet I don't call myself a Theosophist, because I don't believe that the teachings that Madame Blavatsky enunciated, and Dr. Besant and various other great and wonderful people, a few of whom I have met in my younger days, personally, have championed, should be identified as an ism. It is not an ism. It is the 19th and early 20th century incarnation of a tradition, a manifestation of a tradition, which, for lack of a more descriptive word, we often call the esoteric tradition, and which in terms of its discernible antecedents certainly goes back to at least the 1st and 2nd and 3rd century of the Christian era, and in its antecedents even earlier than that. We might almost say that there has always been, as far as we can determine, an esoteric tradition in the world. And that justifies our merciful hope that there always will be one, perhaps in the future. But certainly the coming of what came to be called Theosophy in the late 19th century. Theosophical Society was founded in 1875 on I think November 14th or right around there in New York City, and while Madame Blavatsky, of course, is often recognized by her native nation, and her family connections was Russian, but she was a naturalized American citizen already at that time, and the co-founder, who became her great helper and friend, Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, of course, was a Yankee from Yankeesville. A Connecticut Yankee. There ain't no Yankee like a Connecticut Yankee, And to this day, there is a street in Hartford, Connecticut, named Olcott Street. It's not named after the colonel, but it's named after his family, because the Olcotts are such a well-known family in Connecticut. So in many ways it can really be called a movement that has very, very strong American connections, and that should be something that we can be proud of. Now then, moving from there, once again, the difference between a tradition as such and an ism, a doctrine, a theology, or for that matter a theosophy theology, is great. Because as all the official documents, founding documents of the Theosophical Society even will tell you, the Theosophical Society never demanded a belief in anything of its members. So it was not a belief system. Now that doesn't mean that from time to time some of its members, and sometimes it's very prominent members didn't treat it a little bit like a belief system. Some of that cannot be helped. When you look upon spiritual things primarily as a belief, then you are going to make a belief out of something that isn't really meant to be a belief. And this has happened and is happening, but whether it happens or not doesn't really make that much difference. So that I think it's a good idea to try to clarify that in advance, and when my Theosophical friends hear this talk, I already can see them shaking their heads on the astral plane, oh, there he goes again. He always has to be a heretic. Well, what do you expect a Gnostic to be but a heretic? You know, that's what we are. But let's say in any kind of spiritual ambience has several levels of content, and depending on their inclinations, their psychological and spiritual needs, people will emphasize one or the other or several of these, let's say, layers of understanding. And there are always people who want to believe. There was a kind of a philosopher, a doggone if I remember his name in my own, but I have an excuse since I just turned 90 years old, you know, who wrote a book back in the 60s called The True Believer. Maybe some of you remember. It doesn't make too much difference. But in any event, there are always the true believers there. Unless they have something, a belief system to hold on to, they are not happy. And what the heck, they might as well be happy. You know, I think Lord Buddha and the Buddhists said, you know, that an important thing is for creatures, for living beings to be happy. You know, that is what in Pali is called metta, I think. That goes without saying. But at the same time, if we forget the, in this case, not only the possibility, but the very, very great likelihood that there are deeper strata of this kind of a disclosure. And that certainly the theosophical disclosure, which was enunciated first by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and carried forward by others, especially the immensely talented and astonishing individual whom the world knew as Annie Besant, that there was and there was meant to be, and there is still meant to be, a deeper level of that disclosure. And that deeper level has nothing to do with belief. It has to do with experience. And we might summarize it very inadequately by saying that the theosophical chapter of the esoteric tradition, as it came forth from the latter part of the 19th century onward, is based on certain experiential recognitions. And if these are neglected or covered over by belief and by various mythologizing, then I think the intentions of the revelators, of the disclosers like Blavatsky and Olcott and others are thereby vitiated. So we have to be very careful, and somewhere in the course of this evening's discourse I'll try to pinpoint what I mean there. There is an experiential core that rests lightly upon the structure of beliefs. And this experiential core in Blavatsky's own statements over and over is indicated as being the recognition at a level of practice of the presence within the human of an utterly transcendent element. And the ability of the human being, whether male or female or whatever race or whatever historical period, the ability of the human being to make effective contact with that element in their own nature. That's what it is. And the name, which of course has been used all along, and it's a respectable and euphonious name, Theosophy, was taken by the founders, by this group of, well, what might we call them, eccentric individuals who gathered in New York City in an apartment and who decided to found a society, the Theosophical Society, in 1875. These people were all agreed that a very excellent name for it would be Theosophy, taken from the Neoplatonic philosopher Ammonius Saccus, about 2nd century AD, from Alexandria, who coined that term, Theosophia, the divine wisdom, or the wisdom of the gods. And I think it was a well-chosen name, and that perhaps various beliefs and various mythologies and so forth have come to be connected in the, by now, well, 1975 was 100 years, and well, it's not quite 200 years yet, thank God. In that period of time, obviously various elaborations and additions and admixtures came about, but none of them were or are really able to obscure that central core, that in the human being dwells a divine spark, as the secret doctrine calls it, and that we can actually get close to that and become closer and closer to it until our human personality can really just merge with that internal spiritual essence, and thereby undergo what the ancients, the Greeks, for instance, would have called the apotheosis, the deification, whereby a human becomes a spiritual hero and a demigod or a demigoddess and ultimately a god. Because the Greeks very correctly believed, of course mythologically stated, that the way to Mount Olympus and to the denizens thereof was never closed off, and that humans could join the kingdom of the gods, and that the way they do that obviously is by discovering and cultivating the transcendental, the deific potential within themselves. Now, if that is kept in mind, then I think that none of my theosophical friends, or many others who were my theosophical friends who are no longer with us, because, you know, when as a youngster I came to this building in, well, by then it was, I think, about 1953 or so, we never had less than 100 members of the Hollywood Besant Lodge, and I would say about good 3/4 of them were here at every blessed meeting. So this place was a jumping place, you know, and it was a lot of fun. And what I found particularly a lot of fun was, here I was, you know, in my early 20s, that I had the opportunity to stand up and argue with all these old wise people, you know. whenever they said something that didn't ring right with me, I contradicted them. And the thing is, at first they thought, who is this guy with that strange European accent, and so forth. But after a few sessions, they began to like it. And we had the most wonderful, friendly arguments with each other, the memory of which I still cherish. But of course, those with whom I argued, pretty much without exception, are now in a place where they are difficult to argue with. Let's put it that way. But it was a great thing and a great period. And of course, owing to the chronological factor, the people whom I met here were still very devoted to and very laudatory of Annie Besant, because practically all of them joined the Theosophical Society and were really drawn into this ambience by Annie Besant. I remember a conversation, it's the privilege of old people among whom I can number myself now with full justification. It is the privilege that to tell stories from the past, to reminisce. There is a little reminiscence quite early in my theosophical career. In fact, before I moved to Los Angeles, which was really the beginning of my career. If I had known what Los Angeles would become by now, I don't know what I would have done. But it sure was great then. I believe you me, it really was great. But in any event, the issue here being that first of all, this Theosophia can manifest when people really get close to it in people, and that such people often become very impressive people. So here I met an old gentleman. I met him in Northern California in the glorious town of Redwood City, so a very nice man in his 80s. And so we conversed, and we drove to San Francisco together and things like that, in the course of which I really shouldn't mention, this is such a triviality, but here he was driving, and I never drove a car, not then and not later. But let's say he was driving and he was talking to me, so he kept feeding me a mint candy. Sort of round, and they were called lifesavers. I tell you, to me they tasted awful. So I said, thank you. When he wasn't watching, out came the lifesaver and went out the window. And so he looks over and says, oh, you're done with it already? Here, have another one. So all the way from Redwood City to San Francisco, he fed me lifesavers, which without exception in due course had exited through the window. Now this gentleman was telling me the story of his becoming a theosophist. So he was quite a guy, real old Americana, great, big, tall, muscular gentleman, even in his 80s, just really somebody stepped out of the Wild West, although he didn't wear boots and so forth. And he worked in the lumber business in the forests of state of Washington when he was young, all kinds of things. He was in Seattle, Washington, way back 1920s or maybe even earlier, and he said he was bored, which is of course a common condition of the human race, and maybe more easily incurred in Seattle, Washington than in other places. But that's just to rub a little bit nasty under the nose of the Seattleites. But let's say, so he wanted something interesting to do on a weekend. So he talked to somebody somewhere, probably over a drink, and they said, well, you know, they said, there's this interesting English woman who is here, and she gives lectures, and she's a theosophist, and she's famous for her oratory. She's supposed to be the greatest woman orator in the world. Well, I said, I'm going to go to that. So he went to the hall, great big, you know. This was the period when lectures were really very popular. And so he went in, sat down. So out on the stage came, he says, so this must have been my late 20s because she died in the fairly early 30s. And out came, he said, this little old woman. He said, somewhat bent over and not walking terribly straight and all that. And old Willie said to me, always I thought to myself, oh, DJ, I could have gone someplace else where I would have had fun. So he said, well, I'm here already. So he listened to her. He says, after about 20 minutes, she seemed to grow about 4 or 5 feet. And he says, at the end of the lecture, her head was beyond the roof. He says, she grew in front of him and her oratory. He said that he was absolutely flabbergasted. What tremendous inspiration and energy and convincing power there was in this old English woman. So as the people were filing out, he said, I went straight to the door where the guy was with the papers, said, how can I join this outfit? Oh, here it is, sir. Look. And since then I've been a member of the Theosophical Society. Now, I am sure that this man was not alone in the world, because she was an unbelievably impressive person, especially when delivering a speech. Now, I have a bit of a conundrum because on the one hand, I think that I should present somewhat of a biography of hers. On the other hand, I think there are really more exciting things to say about Annie Besant than her biography. So I'll try to kind of summarize the biographical part as one of her biographers, who was a professor, I think, at Cal State, had summarized. He wrote a book, several volumes, this man. He wrote a book called The 3 Lives of Annie Besant. If you come across it somewhere, it's a good historical work. Let me see. Yeah, his name was Arthur Nedocott. He was teaching at Cal State. And he said that the first life of Annie Besant was that of an Anglican parson's wife. She married the Reverend Besant when she was 20. She had 2 children, a boy and a girl. But quite early in her marriage, she became desperately unhappy, and she was on the verge of suicide. So I always told my theosophical friends, look, if you really feel bad, you feel like doing away with yourself, don't feel alone. Annie Besant felt like that too one time. You know, she did, but only for a while. She was going to kill herself by poison. And she heard an inner voice speaking to her. Oh, coward, coward. who used to dream of martyrdom and cannot stand a few years of woe. And she said, well, whoever said that to me, I better listen to it. So she threw the bottle of poison out the window. I wonder whether anybody ate it there. But in any event, that was her first life that ended at that time with the attempt at suicide. So the second life. Soon began the second life, as it were. She left her husband. Well, it's a kind of a usual beginning for that sort of thing. She took her little daughter with her, and she became the associate and helper of the freethinker writer Charles Bradlaugh, who was quite famous at the time, and together they arranged the publication of several things that they wrote, some of it together, some of it this was, by then this was well, she was in England to begin with, so what I'm talking about. In any event, they wrote several sort of avant-garde pamphlets and books together, and among them they wrote one which caused quite a bit of excitement of an adverse nature about birth control. Well, here we are, after all, abortion is a form of birth control too. It looks like she was saying, in about 200 years it seems that the concerns of humanity haven't changed all that much. In any event, Victorian society, with their great propriety, especially concerning sexual matters, became very agitated over Bradlaugh's and Besant's writing. And so they took them to court for publishing obscenity. But they were condemned, but upon appeal they won their case on the appeal, but the notoriety that Annie Besant acquired permitted her husband, the Reverend, to have her declared an unfit mother and legally take her little daughter away from her. Well, those sorts of things happened then, and even often they happen now. In any event, that was her second life. Her third life, what came to, the author came to call her third life, began then. She was very intellectually active. She was, all her life was tremendously interested in education, and in the latter part of her life, especially in India, where such institutions were not very frequent, she founded several universities, probably the main one which was first called Central Hindu College in Benares and subsequently Benares University. So she went after the university in London. In 1879 she entered London University. She studied science and especially medicine, and people who knew her quite well and knew her associates quite well, and whom I met later on, said that it was the belief of the faculty, the medical faculty of London University, that she was utterly capable of being a doctor. But because she was a woman, they wouldn't give her the doctorate. Incidentally, the only woman doctor for quite a long time, excuse me, Anna Bonus Kingford, who became a friend and disciple of hers, got a medical doctorate, but she got it in Paris. And she was a very beautiful woman, unlike poor old H.P. Blavatsky. So Anna Kingsford, somebody said, those Frenchies will do anything for a beautiful woman, so they made her a doctor. But she also became a theosophist, so they had something in common. So that was the beginning of her third life, and she at first was attracted to what at that particular time in England passed for politics, which was primarily the so-called Fabian Society, excuse me, where she became very friendly with George Bernard Shaw, the great writer and dramatist, Sidney Webb, number of people who became subsequently were elevated to the peerage, such as Sidney Webb, who became Lord Parfield, and Sidney Olivier, who became Lord Olivier. So she, by association, she became quite well connected with Victorian English society fairly early. Ramsay MacDonald, the politician, number of others. Now, many of these people, albeit not all, identified themselves at that time as socialists. But you've got to remember one thing, none of them were Marxist socialists. But many of them were Christian socialists or secular socialists. And you've got to remember, I mean, I don't like the word socialist, then or now. Why? Because I lived under a communist regime that masqueraded as socialist, let me put it, and I don't like that sort of thing. If you had gone through the things that I went through in my family and others, you wouldn't like it either. I assure you, you wouldn't like it. But let's see, that was different times. But we always have to look at the actions of people in history, if possible, within a meaningful historical context. And one of these was that this was right at the apex of the Industrial Revolution. So what did the Industrial Revolution do? It brought industry, mining and factories and so forth. And these factories treated their workers abominably. It was the spirit of the time. Many of the workers there was a lot of child labor. It was a very grim picture. And so it's very understandable that these outstanding people, many of whom came from high society, not Annie Besant so much, tried to help these people. And it was largely, they were really the ancestors originally of the Labour Party in England. But the Labour Party was not a Marxist party. Maybe later on it became somewhat infiltrated with that, but not at that time. So let's see, those were her political associations at the time. Now something happened. We're coming now to the 1880s, and she was, of course, very much involved with all kinds of newspaper editors, magazine editors, book editors, all that sort of thing. And one of them was Mr. W.T. Stead, who edited a very prestigious literary journal of the time called the Review of Reviews. And in the Review of Reviews, he wrote about a mysterious author. And Annie Besant read that, and she knew Steed. She knew her, already about everybody. For one thing, she was a very energetic, very vivacious woman, and when young, also quite good looking. Can't take that away from her. In fact, we shouldn't even try. So she said, come on, you are reviewing the writing of some strange person, and it is called The Secret Doctrine. And come on, send me over some volumes of that stuff. So Mr. Steed sent her the 2 volumes of what then was a new book by this mysterious author, and it was The Secret Doctrine by H.P. Blavatsky. And Dr. Besant, who was not a doctor yet, Annie Besant became very interested in the material, and she wanted, after all, it was the same city, she wanted to meet the author. And so she went for an interview with the author, H.P. Blavatsky, and experienced an instant change of her consciousness and, in fact, of her life. Her longtime associate, Mr. Jinarajadasa, who many years later became the international president of Theosophical Society. He was president when I joined the society, and in fact some of his books in German translation were the first theosophical books that I read. Anyway, Mr. Jinarajadasa, who knew her personally pretty much since that time, 1890s, wrote of this as follows. This is a direct quotation. She separated herself from her secularist friends and from socialism. The new light which she had received inspired her more firmly than ever to the service of the world, but was now not so much to tinker at various evils in the world's organization, but rather to deal with the root of them all, in the light of spiritual laws which govern all existence. This is from a small book that the late Mr. Jinarajadasa wrote, a short biography of Annie Besant. Now, the circumstances under which she became H.P. Blavatsky's disciple are rather dramatic. And I read of those way back when I was in Austria, in one of the very first books on this subject that I read, which it is a book called Wie ich mein Selbst fand, by a disciple of Madame Blavatsky, Helene von Schewitsch, who was a Russian-German married to a Romanian prince, and there the author describes the manner in which Annie Besant converted, shall we say, to H.P. Blavatsky. He says she sat with Blavatsky, and Blavatsky looked at her and said, have you read some of my secret doctrine? She said, yes. So they talked about it a little bit. And meanwhile, with her big eyes, big dark eyes, Blavatsky kept looking at her while she was smoking her self-rolled Russian cigarettes. And she kept looking at her, and Annie Besant looked at her, fell to her knees and grabbed the legs and the knees of Blavatsky, and she said, from now on I am yours, I'll follow you anywhere. And Blavatsky said, well, we don't have to be so forceful about it, but I think we will get along nicely. And that was the beginning. And she never she never let go. She never moved to anything. And people said, "Oh well, that's just that's her latest enthusiasm. What the heck? She was a socialist. She was a Fabian. She was of the Atheist Society, and now she joined some kind of a weird cult of an old Russian woman. And she'll go on to something else." No, ma'am. She never went on to anything else after that. Now she became in short order Blavatsky's, perhaps at least at that time, Blavatsky's closest disciple. So now Annie Besant's occult and theosophical career was on the way. In 1893, a mere 2 years after the passing of H.P. Blavatsky, who was helped and shepherded by her. In fact, H.P. Blavatsky, toward the end of her life, lived in a house that belonged to Annie Besant in a section of London. Merely 2 years after the passing of H.P.B., Annie Besant made her first visit to India. Of course, toward the end of her life, actually prior to her meeting with H.P. Blavatsky, Blavatsky had lived for quite a while in India also. But then she left and moved to London, where she eventually passed away. But Annie Besant's first visit to India, she went. By then the Theosophical Society was active, and the International Convention of the Society in 1893 at Adyar in India, which was and still is the location that she and her friend Colonel Olcott picked out when they were in India, and then managed to purchase, and that which became and remained to this day the international headquarters of the Theosophical Society. So by 1893 the convention was taking place there, and there the venerable founder of the society, the only one left by then, Colonel Olcott, said among others to the assembled members, and I'll read this little paragraph: "Our patient and loyal persistence is about being rewarded by help of the most valuable kind, for there was sent to me," as he said, after all, he was the head of this Anabai, which was what the Indians called her then, Anabai, "to share my burden, relieve our mental distress, and win the respect and sympathy of good people. While she is not yet able to quite fill the void left by the departure of my co-founder H.P.B., that's Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, she will be in time. And meanwhile, she will, by her peerless oratory and her scientific training, be a great helper of ours." So Annie Besant thus became the rapidly rising star of Theosophy the world over, a golden-tongued orator, organizer and writer whose fame was growing all over the world. She was also increasingly regarded as the heir apparent within the Theosophical movement of Colonel Olcott. In the international presidency, perhaps, of the Theosophical Society. They already suspected that at that time. And this sentiment came to be justified when Colonel Olcott began to experience increasingly severe reversals in his health, and in the latter part of 1906 and at the beginning of 1907. And it was in the early part of 1907 that the dear old colonel left this earth. Now I am a little bit in a conundrum because there is information. It is not. It has not been secret for a very, very long time, and I heard it told from a fairly direct source, but at the same time it is an account of events that are very, very strange, and that I myself am not skeptical of, but let's say I am not entirely in accord with the way they are interpreted. Let's say Colonel Olcott was in Adyar, in his room. He was very sick, and they knew that he probably didn't have very long to live. Now, these vignettes that I'm very quickly going to tell you now were told to me and a number of other people by a very interesting gentleman who at the end of his life lived one street over from here on Glen Green Avenue, Mr. Henry Hoeller, and who actually at his death in the 70s willed his little property to Besant Lodge, which the leadership sold at a far too cheap a price, in my opinion, and I ain't no businessman, but in any event, from the proceeds of that house, these stained glass windows were made. These were Mr. Hoeller's gift to Besant Lodge. By the way, we probably never would have had the building without him, because he, living right next door here, he noticed that this building was for sale. Now this was about 55 or thereabouts, and he came down to another location where the lodge was located. I remember I was there too, and he got up and he said, "We have a building that will be ideal for Besant Lodge, and we have to get that building." And of course the theosophical old ladies, "Oh, but Uncle Henry," as everybody called him, "it's so far up there on Beechwood Drive, how are we going to get up there? And then how about this and how about that?" They had all the objections. He said, "We have to get that building." So we got it, and we still got it. We're still here, you know. Anyway, this gentleman had a wife. Not by the time I knew him. She had passed away. Apparently a very extraordinary woman. Her maiden name, or perhaps for the first husband, was Marie Russac. She had been an opera singer. She had been an actress. She wrote beautifully. And in addition to that, apparently had the gift of seership. You know. Again, I cannot testify to it because she wasn't around to look at me, or I wasn't around to look at her by the time I got here. But I certainly heard enough people tell about her, you know, her unusual powers. Anyway, Mrs. Russac, at that time still not married to Henry Hoeller, met Colonel Olcott on one of his trips to England. He was a great traveler, and you know, in those days, in the very early 1900s and in the late 1800s, traveling from here to India and to Australia and New Zealand, it was a terrible task, you know, really a terrible task. But anyway, he met her in England, and he liked her, and he spoke with her, and he said, and she was very, very enthusiastic theosophist by then, he said, "Would you come with me to India and become my secretary?" And she said, "Oh yes, Colonel, anytime." So she got on the boat, and they traveled to India together, and she became his secretary until the day of his death, a few years later. But there are funny little things there too, and if I don't get it all done tonight, and I'll bring it over to Krishnamurti. After all, they knew each other very well. But for instance, they were aboard ship, the colonel and his new secretary. Well, the new secretary, like so many theosophists at that time, had become a vegetarian. And so they were aboard ship, and on a steamer in Victorian times from London to Bombay, there wasn't very much fresh vegetables available. They wouldn't have stayed fresh if anybody tried. But anyway, so she looked more and more piqued. The colonel asks, "What's the matter with you?" He said, "Well, Colonel, I can't find anything to eat." And then I'm hungry. He said, "Oh," he said, "are you one of those carrot eaters?" And she said, "Yes." Well, he said, "You know, we have to remember that we are here for a purpose. We are here to do the work to put the Theosophical Society on the map. And that is more important than anything else, and certainly more important than what we eat." So he said, "Now you come with me to the state room, the dining room, and you eat whatever they'll serve us. When we get to India, when we get to our place in Adyar, we have our own cook, we have our own kitchen. And they will cook anything for us that they can. And then you can eat what you want. But now you have to stay on your feet and stay strong." "All right?" "Yes, Colonel." So they went on that. So that was the lady. Well, she remained with him, very faithful, and did a lot of good work. She was an extremely talented woman. There is at least one magnificent building in the old Krotona up above Beechwood that she designed and had built. And it's a building that is that appears listed in all the big architectural magazines as being one of the best examples on the American continent of what did they call it, the Indian Moorish style. In any event, beautiful place. It's still there. It has been restored in recent times. That was one of her doing. Very, very talented woman. In any event, so there she was trying to tend to the dying colonel. So he says, and these are the things that she told her husband years later. The colonel was abed, pretty sick, very weak, and she was there trying to help him out. And all of a sudden, he rose up in bed, even though he was very weak, and put out his arms and shouted out in a fairly loud voice, "Old horse, you have come to see me." And that was his term of endearment for Madame Blavatsky. But that was only one. Now other things started happening. And again, we only have really her word and that of one or two other people who were there for me. But, with strange people, strange things happen. If this has escaped your notice yet in life, then maybe you still have something to learn. But here, by then I'll say a little more about it if I have the time, or we don't have a watch. Oh yeah, it's okay. In any event, a sort of mythology had grown up in the theosophical circles. Well, there were several, and one of the most prominent theosophists whom I knew, the late Joey Mills, for instance, said that the secret doctrine is a myth. You shouldn't try to make fact out of it. Blavatsky wasn't writing about facts. Blavatsky was writing about things that would have an effect, like a myth does on the individual. So in any event, that's that's really neither here nor there. But in this case, a mythology developed, which, for lack of a more descriptive word, we may call that of the masters. Now, it came from Madame Blavatsky. Madame Blavatsky said in her usual sort of light-hearted way, oh yes, you know, I have these teachers, and they are, some of them are off in Tibet, and some of them are off in Egypt, and when they want to, they come and communicate with me. And they gave me permission, in fact they ordered that we should organize the Theosophical Society. But you know, just like that, like she was talking about, I don't know, some visitor who came in from next door. Now, this, let's say, the mythos, and that's not a put-down word, you know, the mythos of the masters grew on the Theosophists. And it certainly was already blooming quite a bit by the time Colonel Olcott was dying. And Colonel Olcott said, and he wrote in his diaries, he wrote that he said that one of these masters, whom he referred to as the Master Moria, which is a Rajput princely family's name, actually had come to him many times, had instructed him, had told him various things what to do and so forth, and that this was his master. That was it. You also got to remember that master in a British context, and at that time, means a teacher. You're a school master. You're the master of such and such college. So in my humble, or not so humble, in my arrogant opinion, the term master was used here as my teacher. Mm-hmm. So that puts it in a little different context. And there's something crossing my mind that I'm not going to mention. In any event, so there he was, agonizingly lying in bed in his room in Adyar. There was no one in the room at that moment but Mrs. Marie Roussac. And Mrs. Roussac said, through the wall stepped into the room a tall figure, and she described to a T, and Colonel Olcott looked up and he said, my master, Master Moria is here. And he threw himself out of bed, lying on the floor, prostrating himself in front of this apparition. The apparition bent down, picked up the colonel like a baby, and took him back to the bed and laid him down on the bed. Now, I wasn't there, but Mrs. Roussac was there. So I can't believe that these people, some of whom I never knew Mrs. Hochner-Roussac anymore because she died before I got here. I think I would have enjoyed her immensely from all I hear. Whether she would have enjoyed me immensely, I don't know, because I was a nasty young guy, you know. But let's say, I can't believe that these people were lying. I can't. I mean, all their lives and their career subsequently to this indicates that they were utterly honorable, truthful, and devoted people. So, the only thing I can say is that these were psychic experiences. And we know by now that with the psyche one can experience all kinds of things. But at a certain point, when the psychic energy is really powerful, then the psychic realm sort of bleeds over, I hate to use that word, sort of oozes over into the physical. And I trust that some of us have had some experience of that. And that the demarcation between the psychic and the physical is no longer that rigid. So, you know, there are all kinds of curious things. But now, so we wouldn't have to rely entirely on Mrs. Rusak. The servant, the Hindu servant, I forget his name, who waited on Colonel Olcott, and he was sort of their personal servant, came into the room. And he saw the master. And he threw himself on his knees and was touching the earth and reciting some kind of a mantra. Well, what you gonna do? These people experienced something. They seemed like they gave accurate experience, and if you told these stories, as I'm sure they have been told to some of the Indian gurus and so forth, I don't know, maybe even the late Swami Prabhavananda, who used to be up here just a little ways from Krotona, he probably would have said, well, of course we experience things like that all the time, don't you understand? You know, that these are the sort of things that happen in our country, yes? Obviously, these experiences are not as wild and as weird as they would appear to us or even to the Victorian mind. In any event, there were further communications. The master communicated to Colonel and to Mrs. Rusak that the best thing to do would be, as he is passing now, to see to it that Annie Besant becomes president. And the colonel wrote, with his already very feeble handwriting, wrote a document to that effect, that he had orders from on high, and he will ask his fellow members to elect, because they always had an election, to elect Annie Besant as president. And sure enough, when he died, and then the convention got together, and the general council of the various heads of the national sections, she was elected president of the international president, and she was re-elected to that office a number of times, I think about 4 or 5 times, they're always in 7-year increments thereafter. So this is the occult side. May I also throw in, because you know, some of these stories and their interpretation are a matter of very personal concern to me, and they have been a matter of very great concern for many years, and therefore they are still of concern. I struggled with this master business for years and for years and for decades. I came to the conclusion that the way the Theosophists believed in the masters at the time when I became one of the crew, shall we say, that there was something wrong with it. But I couldn't put my finger on what it was that was wrong with it. Because after all, I know parapsychological experiences, so what the heck, I've been seeing stuff all my life since I was a kid, and that doesn't make me any special, but let's say, then I came across first just one sentence in a book called Memories, Dreams and Reflections of C.G. Jung, edited by Aniela Jaffe. And scattered there among all kinds of things where Jung writes a little bit about Philemon, his mysterious spiritual friend, and he said something like, years later I met a gentleman from India in Geneva, where whatever the before United League of Nations was, and I was talking to him about gurus. And the Indian gentleman told me, so wrote you, that, well, most people who are inclined towards spiritual and religious things in India, have a guru. But I, speaking of himself, my guru is Shankaracharya, the great teacher of the past, because I have a guru in the spirit. And all of a sudden a lamp went off in my Hungarian head, and I said, aha, here is something. This is a phenomenon. It has been materialized too much. It has been dogmatized too much. But there is something there. And so Jung saved me from my agnostic attitude toward the Theosophical masters, albeit, no doubt the interpretation is somewhat different. So in any event, now Annie Besant was in charge, shall we say. And with her wonderful oratory, she went all over the world lecturing on Theosophy. And her talents were numerous. For one thing, she was undoubtedly, and nobody, no matter how critical they were of Annie Besant, nobody ever claimed that she was an unbelievably powerful speaker. She sort of went in history as the greatest woman orator of her time. But in addition to that, she was an extremely practical, fabulous organizer. She was a person who had a very strong sense of people, of their character, of what they were like, and consequently selected very talented and very good people as her associates, as her disciples, as the officials of the society, and very few of them did she ever have to be disappointed in. Now, and I say she was, I mean, I could go on, and she was a person of an extremely strong sense of justice and fairness, which for a spiritual leader, the leader of a spiritual movement, is a difficult thing to do. Because one thing about us strange folk, theosophists and psychics and whatever else we might be, is that we are very contentious folk. And we like to fight with each other. We like to argue with each other. We like to contend. We like to contradict what the other one says and believes in and so forth. And to preside over this kind of a motley crowd of ever-growing crowd all over the world of theosophists and keep them from falling at each other's throat. That was itself, I think, a gigantic achievement. But let's say give it a little, maybe a little example. And these were told to me by people almost without exception who knew Annie Besant. A bunch of doctors, medical doctors, came to her in India. And they said, they were all members of the society, I think. They said, Dr. Besant, we have a problem. Well, what is it, my friend? Well, he said, we are medical doctors. We are practicing the allopathic medicine that the British have brought, and we are having good results with it. We are helping the people. But at the same time, we have our ancient Indian medicine, Ayurvedic medicine with all the herbs and all the baths and all of these things. And so some of our people go for that. And they have formed an association of theosophists for the ancient Indian medicine. And where does that leave us? We went to medical school. We invested a lot of money and our times, in our career. And she was thinking of it. She said, gentlemen, I tell you what you could do. Yes, I did charter a lodge, or whatever it was called, of those who are interested in Ayurvedic medicine. But if you come to me and you form a Theosophical association of medicine, of modern medicine, I will charter it for you also. There it was. The argument went right out. So they each had their own forum to discuss things, and they were not antagonistic to each other. So, these were some of her generosity. Similarly, knew no bounds. Now, obviously, she had access to the funds of the Theosophical Society, and she had a salary and so forth. But this was also told to me by someone who was there. She was in America traveling. Everybody traveled by train. She was on the train going through some God-forsaken little place, I think in either in Montana or in Wyoming. Things haven't changed all that much there. I've been there. In any event, there she was, but she sent word somehow there was a local lodge there, that she would be going, the train would be going through there and had a brief stop. And she would like to meet some of her members. So they came out, maybe about 30, 40 people standing in front of the train where the steps go, and out of the steps in her light-colored sari stood Annie Besant. And she said, come my friends, tell me, how is it going? How is the work going? Can you succeed? And so they said, well, Dr. Besant, we are a small group. We don't have any money. We hardly can afford to rent a room where the lodge meets and so forth. And, we are struggling, and our struggle is primarily material. Yeah. She called her Indian secretary, who came out with a case. In the case was her checkbook. She took a pen, and on the spot she wrote out a check to what was a considerably large sum at that time. He said, "Here, use this to help with the work." How many of these health and wealth practitioners of all these money-grubbing spirituality that we have in our country, how many of them would have done that sort of thing? Not a heck of a lot of them. So, she was generous, she was fair, but she was also determined. She had her own views on various things, and they prevailed, and the Theosophical Society grew to, I have the figures here, to a much, much greater size than it ever had. And she was respected even by her critics, I would say even by her enemies. Now, you wouldn't expect her to, after she came into Theosophy, to be involved only with Theosophy. She was a very, very versatile, many-sided person. So one thing that she got involved in was originally I think it was called some other name, like in any event, what ultimately resulted in the independence of India. Self-rule, it was called originally, of India. And so various people gathered around her. It was a political movement, but they regarded her as a great, wise and holy English woman and listened to her. And you know who was her principal rival? Mohandas K. Gandhi. And I read recently, within the last couple of years, maybe 3 years, with my own Hungarian eyes, a speech delivered at Adyar at a convention by a high official of the present Indian government, in which in so many words this official said, "Your leader, Dr. Besant, was right. If we had followed her dictates, the terrible killing at the time of the independence of India would not have occurred, and many, many things would have gone right." She said Gandhi was wrong and Annie Besant was right. This was by India. So let's say there too, she was a visionary and an activist at the same time, and a lot of her visionary activity, let us say, had to do with such things as the freedom of India, various other things, and of course she had to fight both the die-hard colonialists of English provenance and also the radicals in India. You see, she felt that in between them there was a good medial road which would have helped very greatly. There was one thing which I'll reserve in most of its features for next time, where a lot of people would have said that she was really wrong. But let's say there too, I am not so sure. And that was the choice on her part, although she had assistance, let's say, in the choice, of a little Hindu boy who turned up on the shore of the Bay of Bengal, where the Adyar River flows into the Bay of Bengal and where the Theosophical property is, who turned up there a scrawny, skinny, ugly-looking little kid, as those who were there described him. And Annie Besant came to the conclusion, not alone, that this person would become a great spiritual teacher, indeed a kind of messianic figure for the world. And this man's name was Jiddu Krishnamurti. He was the son, one of two sons, of a minor clerk who was working for Annie Besant at the headquarters office. And to his strange career, including his renunciation of his messiahship, our discussions next week, God willing, shall be devoted. Now there, I have never had the honor to see Dr. Besant because she died before I was born. It's very difficult to see somebody that way, except maybe psychically. But from the time that I first heard her, I had a great attraction to her and to H.P. Blavatsky. And I really felt that these were two, whatever I may disagree with the various details of so-called theosophical doctrine, because Theosophy is not supposed to have any doctrine. So it's easy to disagree with, although some people might still get angry with you. But that's easy to take. But let's say these people knew something. And maybe here and there they made mistakes. But what they accomplished, I think, was remarkable. And what they accomplished was that they revived in a totally open, above-board, honest, unconcealed, and you might almost say non-esoteric manner, the best and the crème de la crème of the esoteric tradition. They brought something back that, for all intents and purposes, appeared to be dead. They brought it back. And they brought it back in such a way that the whole world knew about it. Not behind closed doors, not in secret initiations, but in a totally open manner. And the world has profited thereby very, very greatly and still does. The esoteric tradition would be in much poorer shape if it hadn't been for these two women. And they complemented each other. I somewhere in my notes I have a sort of a juxtaposing their characters. If I have enough time next time, maybe I'll read it. But you know, they were in many ways, even though Annie Besant adored Blavatsky, and Blavatsky respected Annie Besant, although she had some criticisms of her. In fact, in one time, Annie Besant was telling her, very early back in the London days, that of all the things that she could do and that she is going to do for the society, how they are going to transform the world. And Blavatsky sat there and looked at her with her big eyes, and she said to her, "Child, you are as proud as Lucifer." Now, to her, Lucifer was not a bad figure. When you see this, you know, don't be so proud. Don't say that you can do all of these things. You know, get a little bit off your high English horse. But at the same time, she was very, very, you know, very, very friendly with her. And so these two accomplished at a spiritual level something very, very tremendous. And although now, of course, the tradition has proliferated, Blavatsky has been called by some fairly knowledgeable people as the grandmother of the New Age, you know, but almost everything that is of an esoteric nature and is authentic goes back to these two. Now, those who proclaim them may not admit that, but they do. Now, some people admitted this. Manly Hall was one. He said that, take away, and these are his words, listen, take away the contribution of H.P. Blavatsky, and all of modern occultism falls like a house of cards. It's in his book called The Phoenix, which has individual chapters of some of the great people, including Blavatsky. And I have often I heard Mr. Hall speak about secret doctrine right here on this stage, and he felt that this was the greatest input of esoteric nature for several hundred years, and he was right. So it behooves us to pay homage to those on whose shoulders we stand, even if we stand. It behooves us to pay homage to people who were good, who were honest, who were well-intentioned, and at the time tremendously inspired and tremendously wise. And that from time to time such people appear in history and can do the kind of things that these two women did, that can happen. That is the hope of the world. It is still the hope of the world and will continue so. Not what the politicians say, not what the scientists say, not what comes out of the colleges, but people like that. They are the hope of the world, they and their contribution. And if we neglect that, then we have done away with the hope. We don't want to do away with the hope, and that is why I gave this little talk, and thank you very much. I've been promising this to some of our people now for years, but we are going, I promise you, before I shuffle off this mortal coil, that we are going to make what would you call it? Not an exhibition, but anyway, a trip to the old Krotona. I can show you the house where Annie Besant used to stay. I can show you the house that Marie Rusak Hochner built, and there are still a whole bunch of structures there. And you know what? If you're a little bit sensitive, and you go up in that neck of the woods up there by the old Krotona, especially at night, you may discern how some of that territory, up to a certain point, it has a light coming out of the ground. Maybe not everybody can see it, but we are here in the close proximity of a sacred ground as far as I am concerned, and I, for one, am very grateful for that. Okay, good.